Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Tonight, Professor Williamson will give his fifth lecture, Philosophy and Theory Comparison. Welcome. Okay.
Right. Thank you. So the first question I will briefly talk about today is why philosophy needs theories, and not everybody agrees that it does need theories. In fact, the people who see philosophy as some kind of enterprise of clarification tend to deny that philosophy is a theory-building enterprise. I mean, of course, they accept that that philosophers in the past have built and advocated theories, but they think that that was based on some kind of misunderstanding about what philosophy should be doing. And so if you just think that philosophy is to do with clarifying matters, then there just seems not to be a role for such constructive theories, or so it might be. But actually, in lecture 3, I was arguing that the need for philosophical clarification, like the need for other kinds of clarification, typically arises in a theoretical context, or unless it's something more practical, which is another matter. But if we're thinking about philosophy as a theoretical, as an enterprise that is not purely practical, then the need for philosophical clarification is going to arise because of the theoretical context that we're in. And I also argued that the clarification of fundamentals is often best achieved through giving a theory about them, so that as with theory construction is not and clarification, they don't have to be rivals. In fact, building the theory is actually, in some circumstances, the best way of giving a clarification. And the example that I was using there was the case of set theory, where we're not giving anything at all like a definition of the fundamental terms of set theory, but we're rather giving the general basic principles about sets on the basis of which we're going to be reasoning. But I think there's a more basic reason for theories in philosophy, which really just bypasses the issue of the role of clarification, which is that, you remember in the first lecture, I was pointing out ways in which philosophy arises from our natural curiosity. And our curiosity leads us to ask various questions. But the answers to these questions are going to have to be theories. I mean, the kind of definition that you might get from a dictionary would not be what the question is really asking for. And so for example, if we're asking the question, what is justice? A very old philosophical question. Then to answer it, we're going to need a theory of justice. That's just what the kind of answer that the question requires will be. And similarly, to answer the question, what is knowledge? We're going to need a theory of knowledge. That's some kind of general account of justice or knowledge. So the need for theories in philosophy is very directly connected with the origin of philosophy in curiosity, because the theories are simply going to be the answers to our philosophical questions. And I take it that questions like what is justice and what is knowledge, that these are good questions. They may need to be refined in various ways, but these are fundamentally good questions to be asking. And even when philosophers give what's called an analysis of something, like, for example, an analysis of knowledge, such as knowledge is justified true belief. Of course, we know that's an incorrect analysis, but it's still an analysis. I think what they're most naturally understood as doing is giving a really simple theory of knowledge, a simple answer to the question, what is knowledge? And in that respect, it's not so different from something like water equals H2O, which is an answer to the question of what is water. But it's also an analysis of water. But the analysis isn't an alternative to a theory. It's a particular kind of theory. And in giving these theories, these analyses in this particular case, they're not about the word knowledge or water, because these theories can be translated into other languages. And it'll still be the same theory there, just as water equals H2O could be translated into other languages. If you remember what I was saying in lecture 3, of course, another possibility that some philosophers would like to propose at this point is that although they're not theories about the word knowledge or water, that they're theories about the concept of knowledge or the concept of water. Well, I think, of course, in the case of water equals H2O, it's very obvious that that's not a theory about the concept of water, or at least it's not an analysis of the concept, because you can have the concept of water without understanding anything about hydrogen and oxygen. But people sometimes thought that in the case of something like knowledge is justified true belief, in the case of a philosophical analysis, it could be understood as an analysis of the concept. In lecture 3, I was arguing that the kind of theory of concepts that you need for such an account is not really going to work, because it depends, roughly speaking, on a problematic distinction between conceptual and non-conceptual truth. But I think it's also, in a more straightforward way, it's fairly clear that when the main reason for asking that question is not a reason which would be answered by talking about the concept of knowledge, because the concept of knowledge, however exactly we explain it, has something to do with the way in which we think about knowledge. But when somebody asks what is knowledge, they're not assuming that we're already thinking about knowledge in the right way. They're allowing that we might be thinking about knowledge in some very confused way, and so that they as if we were to talk in terms of concepts at all, they might say that perhaps our present concept of knowledge is very bad, but what we really need to do is understand knowledge itself. And in fact, that knowledge itself is something that is a much more generally interesting topic to ask about than the concept of knowledge, because knowledge is so fundamental to the relation of any being with a mind to its environment. So what are called philosophical analyses, I take them to be most naturally understood as simply theories about the thing itself, about knowledge itself or justice itself, and not about words or even concepts. Of course, the fact that we have from Edmund Gettier counterexamples to the knowledge is justified true belief understood as an identity shows that it's a false theory. And if there were a true analysis of knowledge, it would be a true theory of what knowledge is. Now, of course, I don't want to suggest that all philosophical theories are analyses. So, for example, theories of sets in mathematics, they're not analyses of what it is to be a set. They do not provide, and they don't attempt to provide, necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a set. But they do tell us quite a bit about sets. And in the case of as it were, a more mainstream philosophical question, the theory that knowledge is unanalyzable is a theory of knowledge, but it's obviously not an analysis of knowledge, because if it were an analysis of knowledge, it would be completely self-defeating. And I take it it's not self-defeating to suggest that knowledge is unanalyzable. In fact, I think in some fundamental way, it's true. So that's just an initial sketch of why philosophy needs theories, why it's going to be a theory building kind of enterprise. But mostly what I want to do today is to talk about how we can test whether a philosophical theory is true, how we decide between different philosophical theories. So given that, as I've been suggesting, that a theory is an answer to a question, then the natural way to test a theory is by comparing it to other answers to the same question. So, as well, we want to find the best answer to that question. And so that's going to mean that the testing of philosophical theories is naturally understood as comparative. We're taking the available theories and asking which of them is best. So, for example, normally a theory of knowledge is an answer to the question, what is knowledge? So we assess it by comparison with other answers to that question. In other words, other theories of knowledge. I mean, you could have a theory of knowledge which was addressed to some other questions about knowledge, and then if that was if those were alternative questions about knowledge, if those were the ones we were interested in, then we would compare the theory to other answers to those questions. And it's important to emphasize that this comparative aspect of theory assessment is common to philosophy and natural science. It's not some distinctive feature of theory assessment in philosophy. And in fact, it's going to be common to a very wide range of inquiries, because inquiries are understood as attempts to answer a certain question. And so whenever we're doing that, we're going to be engaged in comparisons between different answers to the same question and try to work out which of them is best. So this is just a completely normal aspect of theory assessment. It's not something that's special about philosophy. And if we want to understand this process in more detail, then I think we have to ask what dimensions theories are compared on. Because there are various different ways in which one theory can be better or worse than another. And so a lot of what I'll be doing in this lecture is discussing different dimensions on which theories are compared. And I should, yes, before I go into detail on this, one thing I should emphasize is that what we really want to know in this inquiry is which answer to the question is correct. And so that sort of overall interest in getting to know the truth is going to be behind the different kinds of dimension that we're interested in. But the relation between these different dimensions of comparison and the truth is not always a simple or direct one. So one dimension that is worth discussing straight away, because it has to do with whether something even really is a candidate answer to the question, is the dimension of strength. And strength in this context has a fairly specific meaning. And it has to do with informativeness. So a theory should be informative rather than uninformative, because otherwise it does not adequately answer the question. And just as a simple non-philosophical example of that would be if you ask when does the lecture start, and somebody answers that it starts sometime in the year 2020. I mean, that may be true, but it's uninformative to the point where it may not really be in the context an answer to the question at all, because the question may be asked with some kind of background conditions on what level of informativeness will count as answering the question at all. So, well, just to give a trivial example in the case of philosophy, if somebody put forward as a theory of knowledge just the claim that knowledge is knowledge, that would be true, it would be correct, but it would be uninformative, and it would surely not count as an answer to the question, what is knowledge, of the kind that met the sort of implied conditions in the context for that question. And so an informative theory is called strong because it says a lot, and an uninformative theory is called weak, it says little. It's just worth remarking that in some ways this use of the word strong and weak is kind of the opposite of what you might expect, because it's the strong theories that are in most danger of being refuted, because they say so much that it can easily turn out that what they say is not all correct. Whereas the weak theories, the uninformative ones, because they say very little, they may be relatively safe, as in the case of knowledge is knowledge. And so strength doesn't mean that that they're particularly safe from refutation. And it kind of means the opposite. It's just strong in this very specific sense. Another clarification, which I think it would be natural to understand anyway, but it's worth making explicit, that if we're talking about a theory of a given subject matter, X, the theory has to be informative about X. And so if you just add a whole lot of irrelevant information to a theory, that doesn't make the theory better as an answer to the question that we started with. Because the irrelevant information doesn't give us a better answer to that question. And so in what follows, we're just going to be not considering irrelevant information. And so all the kinds of comparison we're talking about and so on will be with respect to relevant information. And that, as I say, that's probably what you would have assumed anyway, but it's worth saying. And, well, as I've already indicated, strength isn't by itself, as it were, particularly conducive to truth. A theory can be strong, but false. I mean, the theory water equals carbon is strong, but false. It's highly informative because it sort of says a lot, but what it says is wrong. So when we're not looking at strength as something that by itself makes a theory more likely to be true, and in fact, if you think in terms of probability, the stronger we make a theory, then other things being equal, the less probable it will be. But we need the strength partly in order to answer the question, but also because certain other kinds of virtues of a theory that we'll discuss later on require the theory to be quite strong. And so there is a kind of an underlying tension between the advantages and, I mean, the costs and the benefits of strength, which comes out in various ways, and which can become quite acute sometimes when we're thinking about these issues in a probabilistic context. But I'm not going to say very much about that today. And again, I want to emphasize that the role of strength in philosophical theories is very similar to its role in theories in natural science and elsewhere, this is not something that is special about or exceptional about philosophy. So one quite helpful way of thinking about strength is that strength has to do with excluding many possibilities. As it were, the more you say, the more possibilities you're excluding. And so a strong theory excludes many possibilities, whereas by definition, a false theory excludes the actual possibility. And I mean, that makes it very vivid why the strength is not in itself particularly conducive to truth. Indeed, it's more conducive to falsity. So this way of thinking in terms of possibilities is helpful, although, as we'll see, it can be a bit misleading in some ways. So we shouldn't take these possibilities too seriously, and in particular, these possibilities may not be metaphysical possibilities. So in mathematics and in philosophy, often the questions that we're asking are ones where whatever the right answer is, it will be a necessary truth. When we're asking what is knowledge or what is justice, we're not asking for contingent facts about knowledge and justice, such as how much knowledge or how much justice there is in a particular society. We're asking for the necessary nature of these things. And that means that, in a sense, from a metaphysical point of view, there is only one possibility, which is the true one. And so any alternative answer to those questions, any false theory of justice or of knowledge, is actually going to be impossible, because it will contradict the nature of knowledge. And I mean, you could talk about these possibilities as epistemic possibilities, although even there, the notion of possibility, it can be misleading, because even if we're talking, I mean, the way many people think about epistemic possibilities, and in fact, the way that's best understood, that if you have two logically equivalent statements, then they will exclude the same possibilities as each other. And they will also include the same possibilities as each other. But you can have many answers which correspond to the same set of possibilities, but which differ linguistically from each other in cognitively very significant ways. For example, in mathematics, it may be that ultimately some true mathematical triviality, like 2 + 2 = 4, is actually logically equivalent to some very, very deep and difficult theorem of mathematics, such as Fermat's last theorem, which took hundreds of years to be proved. And so if we think about what possibilities are being excluded, in a way that way of thinking doesn't really work very well once we have to take seriously the fact that we don't always realize the logical consequences of a particular statement, and that's true in mathematics, but it's also going to be true in philosophy, and so this talk of excluding possibilities, I think we could just regard it as a kind of helpful, idealized toy model of a messy cognitive reality, where what we're dealing with often are things which appear to be possibilities, but are not genuine possibilities. Maybe not even genuine epistemic possibilities, because it might be that although they appear to be possible, they're in fact excluded logically by things that we already know. And we could also talk about different answers to the same question, as to think of these possibilities as just kind of options on a menu or something like that. But in a kind of picturesque way, this idea of excluding many possibilities, of excluding regions of logical space, is quite a helpful and vivid way of thinking, even though if you push it too hard, it doesn't work perfectly. But I think it's as long as we're aware of its limitations, it can still be a useful heuristic, if you like, for thinking about the issue of strength. And so I'll continue to talk in these terms for a bit, but with that kind of health warning about the limitations of this way of thinking. So one obvious thing to say is that strength comes in degrees. So it's not just that there's a binary distinction between strong and weak. There's a scale of weaker and stronger. And roughly speaking, in this heuristic way of putting things, the more possibilities a theory excludes, the stronger it is. And of two strong theories, one can be stronger than the other. One can exclude even more than the other does. Now, there's a very specific way in which a theory can be too strong. So if we take an inconsistent theory, one that in some way implicitly contradicts itself, it actually excludes all possibilities. And because it excludes all possibilities, it is technically, it counts as maximally strong. But of course, assuming that we think that we're accepting classical logic where the truth must be consistent, an inconsistent theory is terrible from our point of view because it can't be true. So the ideal is not maximal strength, but it's excluding all the non-actual possibilities, but not excluding the actual possibility, leaving the actual possibility open, as well, the actual theory. And so the theory that excludes all but the actual possibility that's the strongest true theory. And so if we're thinking of what the ideal level of strength is, it's excluding all possibilities except one, because that's basically giving, at least implicitly, giving answers to all the relevant questions. So theories that attain that optimal level of strength, they're the strongest consistent theories. And in logic, those theories are of great interest, especially if you're concerned with things like completeness proofs, and they're called maximal consistent theories. So, of course, we don't just want our theories to be self-consistent. We also want them to be consistent with our evidence. And I think people, they often wonder when we start talking about evidence in relation to philosophy, what on earth this evidence might be. Because, of course, the point that a theory should be consistent with our evidence, that would be standard for the natural sciences as well. But we need to think about how this constraint applies to philosophy. So in the previous lecture, I was talking about one source of evidence, which is thought experiments. So from thought experiments, we learn various facts. But I don't want to suggest that thought experiments are the only source of evidence in philosophy, and that would definitely not be true. So if we just take for an example theories of justice, and we think about what kind of evidence they have, what is relevant to them, I think it's pretty clear that if we start off knowing nothing whatsoever about justice, that we simply are not in a position to develop a theory of justice. We just don't know what we're talking about. And we can't even really get started with a theory of justice. Because if we really know nothing about it, then I think we're not able to recognize cases of justice or of injustice to begin with, and so we're not really engaging with that subject matter at all. But as long as we have, to begin with, some ability to recognize cases of justice and cases of injustice, then they will constitute an initial source of evidence for our inquiry, and so it might be that we do thought experiments about imagining certain situations and what would be just and unjust in them. But of course, in everyday life, we have normally plenty of experience of justice and of injustice. And I'm not just talking about at the level of courts and so on, but even within families. I mean, children, very young children, are often extremely concerned about, well, of course, in English, they wouldn't use the word justice. They would talk about fairness. They would say that's not fair. And they're able to recognize cases of fairness and unfairness. For example, if at a birthday party somebody's cutting the cake, and the child who's cutting the cake is cutting much bigger slices for their friends than for the other children, then it's quite normal that children recognize that as a case of unfairness and I think fundamentally of injustice, and so, as it were, both through thinking about hypothetical examples, in particular in thought experiments when it's done elaborately, and in thinking about real life cases, we're making a lot of judgments about what's just and unjust, and those judgments, I take it that in many cases they are knowledgeable. They express knowledge that something is just or unjust, and therefore, given the equation of our knowledge with our evidence, they're fit to be evidence for the assessment of different theories of justice. We can compare what those different theories of justice say about cases and see whether it's consistent with what we already know about justice. Now, of course, it's very likely that some of those pre-theoretic judgments of what's just or unjust are mistaken. They will not all be knowledge. But the inquiry can still go ahead because it may be that gradually, through developing theories of justice, that we come to recognize that some of the judgments that we started with were incorrect. But that is only another manifestation of something that I was emphasizing from the beginning of these lectures, which is the fallibility of all sources of evidence. And what would not work would be if we started by making a whole lot of judgments of what's just or unjust that were simply unrelated to what really was just or unjust. I mean, if our initial judgments were so wildly off, then we couldn't expect that we would arrive at a correct theory of justice, or even an approximately correct one, or even tending to that way. I mean, we would be completely in the dark. But as long as we've got, to begin with, some capacity for recognizing cases of justice or injustice, in other words, for coming to know that certain cases are examples of justice or examples of injustice, then the fact that our judgments of those matters will not always be knowledge is not something that's too problematic. I mean, again, just to make the analogy with the natural sciences. So if our sense perception was completely unrelated to what was actually going on in the external world, then we would not be really able to get natural science started, because we just wouldn't be in touch with what we were trying to theorize about. But in fact, we could hardly even ask the questions in the first place. But the normal starting point for natural science is that we are in a position to know quite a lot about our environments, but we also make various kinds of mistakes, because we're subject to various sorts of perceptual illusion and so on. So as long as we have a capacity for perceptual knowledge, the fact that it's fallible, that we will also make some false perceptual judgments, is something that science can deal with by eventually rooting out the fallacious judgments. So we don't need to start with any kind of infallible capacity, but we do need to start with a capacity that has, some reasonable power of getting us knowledge about particular cases. And then once we can recognize particular cases of justice and injustice, then that's already a basis for a theory of justice to be tested against. We can see whether it's actually consistent with this kind of knowledge that we already have of justice or injustice in particular cases. So one very straightforward aspect of this requirement of consistency with the evidence is that because all evidence is knowledge, and knowledge requires truth, all evidence is true. And so a theory inconsistent with some evidence is false, because all truths are consistent with each other. So the requirement of consistency with evidence is a completely natural one, given that evidence has to be true. Although, of course, we can be mistaken about what is true. And so we can be mistaken as to what our evidence contains, what was part of our evidence. So if we misjudge pre-theoretically some example and take it to be an example, let's say, of justice, when in fact it was an example of injustice, then our original judgment that it was a case of justice, we'll be taking the content of that as part of our evidence, but it's not really part of our evidence because it's false. It's an illusion that it's part of our evidence. And one way in which we may end up discovering that it was false and so not part of our evidence is through formulating more general theories about justice. So what we're talking about is a self-correcting kind of inquiry where lots of mistakes are made along the way, but there's a mechanism for correcting them. And that's exactly the same in both philosophy and natural science. Now, it's not just that a theory should be consistent with our evidence. I mean, actually, this is a case where the issue of strength comes in again, but you can very weak theories are likely to be consistent with our evidence, but that's not enough. So we want the theory to do more than just be consistent with the evidence. We want it to explain the evidence. So just to take the case of theories of justice again, if we took the trivial theory that justice is justice, that would be consistent with all our evidence because it's true and the evidence is true, but it wouldn't explain any of our evidence. It wouldn't tell us anything about why some of these cases were cases of justice and why other cases were cases of injustice. And in general, if our evidence is telling us that some relevant fact holds, then we would like our theory of the subject matter to explain why that fact holds. And these desiderata, these, as it were, things that we would want for evidence, they're the same in natural science. There's nothing distinctive about philosophy here. So, well, this is just to repeat a point that I've already made, but a philosophical example is if part of our evidence is that a given action in a given scenario is unjust, then an ideal theory of justice would explain why it's unjust. And so, of course, we need to say something about what kind of explanation we're talking about. And in philosophy, the kinds of explanation that we're giving, and typically they're not non-causal. We're not explaining things by giving the causes of them. So if a particular action is unjust, we're not talking about an explanation of what caused the unjust action. What we're asking for is what's sometimes called a constitutive explanation, or at least in many philosophical cases. So we're asking for an explanation of what constitutes the injustice of the action, why that action was unjust, what was unjust about it. And so that is one difference between philosophical explanations and at least many explanations in natural science, which are causal. But it's not a universal generalization. I mean, a universal difference, because in natural science too, not all explanations are causal explanations. I mean, if we explain one law, I mean, a relatively specific law by a more general law, it's not really that the general law is causing the more specific law to hold, because causation is a relation between events, and a certain law being true isn't an event. So in natural science too, there are various kinds of non-causal explanation, just as there are in philosophy. So we shouldn't think of these explanations as having to be reductive. So, for example, if we were asking why a certain case of justice was a case of justice. Let's say why the equal division of the cake was an example of justice, and the unequal division of the cake between the children was an example of injustice. We can't always expect that these explanations will take the form of equating justice with something else, or something specified in other and more basic terms, because when we're dealing with fundamentals in philosophy, there may be no such analyses. I mean, I've already mentioned the possibility that, for example, that knowledge can't be analyzed in more basic terms, and so when we're talking about a particular example of knowing or an example of not knowing, is when we want to understand why it is such an example. We can't expect that the answer has to take the form of, as it were, an analysis of knowledge in more basic terms, and then an explanation in those terms of why this was a case of what it was. But we can still hope that that many individual cases can be brought under illuminating generalizations. I mean, a rather simple example of that is the principle that whatever is known is true. Is not a reductive analysis of knowledge or whatever, but it's just a necessary condition on knowledge. But it's a necessary condition which can be used to explain why a whole range of things are not cases of knowledge. I mean, if we've got somebody who believes that the Earth is flat, then all we need to do to explain why they don't know that the Earth is flat is to point out that the Earth is not flat. I think at a more interesting level, we may also be able to unify several generalizations under one broader generalization, and that's supposed to be one of the great advantages of Newtonian mechanics, that it unified the laws of terrestrial and celestial motion. In other words, before Newton, there were already some laws of motion on Earth, and there were also available laws of the motion of the planets and so on. But what Newton did was to bring both sets of laws under generalizations which covered both, and I think that kind of unification is a very satisfying kind of explanation of lower level laws, which can happen in the natural sciences. But I think it's also, in principle, something that we may be able to do in philosophy as well, that we may be able to group together a whole lot of apparently disparate phenomena under much broader generalizations. Well, this is a further point now that I'm making, but when we're doing this kind of comparison in respect of explanatory power in assessing theories, what we're doing is looking at the explanatory power of different answers to the same question. And I mean, that's important because some questions are more susceptible to very strong sorts of explanation than others. so that, I mean, the kinds of explanation that are available in natural science. It may be that we can't get explanations that for example, are as mathematically rich as some of those explanations in physics. But what we should be doing when we're thinking about philosophical explanations is not so much asking whether they're as good as ones in natural science as asking which of the ones that are available for the given question is the best. So, because in some cases, we may be dealing with areas where the quality of available explanations is not as high as in others, perhaps because the phenomena are messier. So what I've been talking about is related to a very common pattern of argument in natural science known as inference to the best explanation. And so roughly the idea is of the available theories of the relevant topic, we're going to accept the one which best explains our evidence. And this is quite similar to a kind of argument that Charles Sanders Peirce calls abduction. I mean, some people claim that there is a significant difference between inference to the best explanation and abduction, but maybe there are some subtle differences. But the extant attempts to explain what the difference between them is are not very satisfactory. So it's not clear to me that these are very different phenomena. And I think the general sort of account that Peirce gives of abduction can be applied in philosophy. So I'm going to be using the latter term. But as I say, I think a lot of what's going on is very similar to what happens in inference to the best explanation, and perhaps that term is equally applicable to at least many of the philosophical examples. So one fairly obvious thing is that abduction is a form of ampliative inference. That means it's non-deductive, so that the premises do not logically entail the conclusion. So with the kinds of arguments that we've been discussing, it's perfectly possible to have what intrinsically is a good argument by abduction or inference to the best explanation, but where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. And again, as I keep saying, this is still how theories are typically derived in natural science, since our evidence is usually logically consistent with many alternative theories of the given topic. And we're in roughly the same position in philosophy. So, for example, I mean, suppose that our evidence for a theory of justice consisted of the fact that we looked at many particular cases where the question of justice or injustice arose, and we recognized in each of these cases whether it was a case of justice or of injustice. Those data do not uniquely specify a single theory of justice. There are many theories of justice which would agree with that evidence about those particular cases, but then diverge on some further cases. And so what I want to insist is that abduction is as legitimate in philosophy as in natural science. There's no reason for thinking that it would be okay in natural science, but not okay in philosophy. So, of course, when people hear this, they often think that, if philosophy uses abduction, doesn't that imply that it must use empirical methods such as doing experiments and making observations and measurements to provide evidence for abduction to work on? But I've, in a way, I've already given that the answer to that. That philosophy's evidence comes from other sources. Well, of course, one case is thought experiments, but it also comes from what, in a way, you could call observation, but simply of actual cases where we classify the cases as cases of justice or injustice. And so the fact that philosophy is an abductive discipline, that's how we assess theories against each other in philosophy, does not mean that we have to imitate the methods of natural science. And in fact, it's not very obvious how many of those methods would even be relevant or helpful to the questions that we're asking in philosophy. And well, of course, when it's not that we're excluded from using evidence gathered by those means, but as I mentioned in the previous lecture, but it's just that such evidence often isn't really what we need in the case of philosophy. And another consideration, which I won't say much about today, but maybe in the next lecture I'll discuss a bit more, is that there is an abductive element to logic and mathematics as well, because they use abductive methods, not all the time, but to decide on their first principles without doing experiments or making observations or measurements. This is something that Bertrand Russell emphasized. So although making the deductions from the axioms is a deductive matter, deciding what axioms we should be relying on, it has an abductive element. And so the mathematics is also an example of a discipline which uses abductive methods in the limited way that I've just sketched, without needing to follow the methodology of a natural science. And so that's a precedent for philosophy. Now, the next topic, which in fact the one I'm going to spend in one way or another the rest of the lecture on, is our role of what we can call aesthetic criteria in abduction. So abduction also gives weight to further criteria in comparing theories, especially simplicity and elegance. Other things being equal, simple theories beat complex ones, and elegant theories beat ugly ones. And this is an aspect of abduction which is puzzling, but it's hard to see how abduction could work without it. And you can see that it's important in the natural sciences from how much scientists talk about elegant explanations and elegant theories and so on. And of course, they accept that a theory may be elegant but false, but the elegance is a key aspect often of the case for a certain theory. But as I say, it's hard at first to understand how these aesthetic criteria are relevant, because it seems if we're preferring simple or elegant theories, doesn't that mean that we're kind of expecting the truth to be simple or elegant? And the question is, well, what basis have we for that expectation? I mean, don't we know that the truth can often be very complex and very ugly? And so this is something that we need to think through. And I should say that I I don't think that the role of aesthetic criteria in natural science is fully understood, although some progress has been made on it. And so I don't think we should expect to be able to understand their role better in philosophy than for the natural sciences. But I think we need to reflect on it. And I mean, one thing I want to emphasize is that without aesthetic criteria, theory comparison in science would break down, because we just couldn't discriminate between, in fact, infinitely many rival theories. And this is a role of aesthetic criteria, and that is important in science, but it's not totally invisible, but it's easily missed, because its role is often to prevent scientists from even thinking of a whole range of theories that could be formulated, which are simply ruled out on these kind of grounds. So I'm just going to give a very toy example, but I think you will be able to see that such examples could be elaborated in a more realistic and detailed way. So let's just assume that theory T1 that's our favorite theory of physics, whatever that happens to be, and that T2 is some rival theory of physics. So T2, let's say, is inconsistent with T1. And let's now consider a kind of hybrid theory, which is mostly like T1, but a little bit like T2, because it says that things always behave according to T1, except that they behave according to T2 in central London on Christmas Day 2099. I mean, you'd have to say something about exactly what happened at the borders between that region of space-time and the rest. But in principle, you could have a theory like this. So it's saying that T1 almost always works, but there's just this little area of central London on Christmas Day 2099 where T2 is the right theory. Now, I think it's perfectly obvious that physicists would not even consider T star as a rival to T1 and T2. And if someone put forward T star, this hybrid theory, as a rival in a conference or something, they would just be laughed at, and nobody would take them seriously. No journal would want to publish this, or except as a joke, and so on. And yet, it seems that T star fits our evidence as well as T1 does, because they only diverge in the future. I mean, let's assume that T1, it's not that we already know that T1 is correct. We've got quite a lot of evidence for it, but we don't yet know that it's correct, and we don't know that T2 is incorrect. And so, since our evidence primarily concerns the past, it may be that T star fits our evidence just as well as T1 does, because their predictions about everything that's happened so far are the same. And so the main trouble with T star seems to be a kind of aesthetic one, and we might use the words like it's too complicated, inelegant, ugly, messy, ad hoc, etc. And of course, I mean, I've given one example, but I think it's clear that in principle, one could construct infinitely many alternative theories like T star. I mean, for a start, by varying the particular region of space-time where things behaved according to T2. And I think it's not just clear that physicists would not take T star seriously. I think it's also clear that if they had to take theories like T star seriously, then physics would find it very hard to make progress because there's just an infinite variety of these theories which are not yet eliminated by our evidence. And so physicists would just be overwhelmed by the number of alternative theories that they were expecting to be choosing between. So there's a pragmatic aspect to it, but it also seems that there's really virtually no chance that T star is the correct theory. And so we are treating these aesthetic criteria as in some way truth relevant. And I mean, it is somewhat puzzling, but it also seems that if physics didn't do this, it would be in big trouble. And I think if aesthetic criteria play this useful role in natural science, I don't see any reason why they shouldn't play a similarly useful role in philosophy. Of course, you could wonder whether there's actually a similar problem of proliferating rival philosophical theories. But I think it's clear that there is. So let's take theories of mind-body relations, which there's a paradigm of philosophical theories. So let's suppose that T1 is our favorite theory of mind-body relations, and T2 is a rival theory of mind-body relations, and we don't yet know which of those is correct. And then T star in this variant case would be the theory of mind-body relations, on which things always behave according to T1, or not just behave, but T1 is correct of mind-body relations, except for Central London on Christmas Day 2099, where mind-body relations are like T2. So if, for example, if T1 was some kind of mind-body identity theory, and T2 was dualism, it would be that the identity theory was between mind and body was correct everywhere and at all times, except for there was this little blip of dualism in Central London on Christmas Day 2099. I've written physicists would not even consider T star as a rival to T1 and T2, but that should say philosophers. I mean, something like T star would not be a serious alternative theory of mind-body relations, even though it may be just as consistent with our evidence as T1, particularly because T1 and T star diverge only in the future. And again, the trouble with T star seems to be aesthetic. It's just too complicated, inelegant, ugly, messy, ad hoc, and all those sorts of things. And again, in principle, it's obvious that infinitely many alternative theories like T star could be constructed. So it seems to me that philosophy is in fundamentally the same position as physics when we think of cases like this, that in both there is this infinite proliferation of alternative theories, which are as consistent with the data as the normal theories, but which are not even considered by philosophers because of their, it seems, aesthetic vices. And it's kind of puzzling why those aesthetic defects should rule them out, but it seems very, very plausible that they should, and it also seems that we would be in big trouble if we had to take all such theories seriously. I want to discuss some ideas that Malcolm Forster and Elliot Sober put forward about the role of simplicity. I don't think that these are ideas that would fully explain the role of simplicity, but I do think that they're helpful in understanding one role of simplicity, and they're interesting because they apply to philosophy as well as to natural science, and this has to do with a problem that is recognized in the natural sciences, called overfitting. So this is a problem which arises in relation to a sort of common task in natural science, which is to fit a curve, or really the curve is just a way of illustrating an underlying mathematical equation, to a set of data points. We've collected various bits of evidence, and now we want to explain them by postulating a certain law or equation relating these different variables. Now, for mathematical reasons, it's normally possible to find a curve to fit the data points perfectly, provided that we're willing to use a complex enough equation. I mean, technically a polynomial with enough non-zero coefficients, but and so it seems that, supposing we're measuring the value of some quantity q at different times t, and so we've just got a data point for various different times and of the value of q at those times, and these are all numbers, then there will be an equation which exactly predicts the data that we've observed. It'll be typically a very complicated equation, but there will be one. But doing so tends to give unstable results. When new data points are added, a very different curve, in other words, equation, is needed to get a perfect fit. So although that we can get a perfect fit at any given point, what tends to happen if you go for a perfect fit is that then as soon as you get new data, you have to completely change the equation. And I mean, you get a new equation which gives you a perfect fit, but then the same thing will happen as more and more data come in. So it seems that although one might think of perfectly fitting the data points as an ideal, that's actually not such a good thing to do after all. And it seems that what goes wrong is that perfect fitting makes the curve sensitive to even very slight inaccuracies in the data. So in a certain respect, it's this kind of perfect fitting is paying too much respect to the data and not recognizing that there may be inaccuracies in the data. And so the overfitting is this phenomenon of fitting your curve too closely to the data and then getting instability as a result of the inaccuracies in the data. And so in practice, allowing some trade-off between goodness of fit and simplicity of curve gives more robust results because it smooths over slight inaccuracies in the data. So if we insist that we're only going to allow really quite simple equations, maybe even just linear equations or perhaps quadratic or whatever, but allowing only very few coefficients, then we can, that will, although the fit at any given time will not be perfect, we have a much better chance that we'll be able to stick with that same equation as new data come in, that, and again, it still won't be a perfect fit, but we will get an approximate fit that is robust, that survives the introduction of new data. Whereas if we insist on a perfect fit, we don't get that robustness. The equations that we work with constantly have to keep being changed. And this is as it were, the problem of overfitting and the use of relatively simple equations to deal with it. That's something that scientists have encountered in practice. This is a recognized problem with a certain type of methodology that gives too much weight to the evidence, paradoxically. So the question is overfitting a problem in philosophy too? Because if it is, then that would help explain in the same kind of way why simplicity can play a useful role in philosophy that isn't just to do with, as it were, arbitrarily cutting down the number of alternatives that we consider. So I want to suggest that overfitting has in fact been a problem in philosophy, but one that has not been widely recognized by philosophers, although it should have been. So I think a case where it's arisen is in research programs in analytic philosophy of analyzing all sorts of things that we're interested in, like knowledge, causation, free will, justice, and so on. And just to keep things simple, we can think of the data points as being supplied by thought experiments that tell us that you have knowledge in this case and not in that case, or justice in this case and not in that case, and so on. And then the proposed analyses played the role of the curves or equations. So in practice, what happened was that the analyses typically became more and more complicated, inelegant, ugly, messy, ad hoc, as more and more thought experiments were considered. And so we were getting exactly what you'd expect from overfitting, because the philosophers were insisting that the analyses had to play. I mean, they had to predict the results which we pre-theoretically gave about all these cases of whether they were all which were cases of knowledge and which weren't. And so the effect of that was that the analyses were oversensitive to any errors in the thought experiments. I mean, you remember last time when I was talking about thought experiments, I was saying that we needed some kind of method that wasn't beyond the method of thought experiments to help us catch any kind of systematic errors that were being made in the thought experiments itself. Not errors that were the result of some kind of individual failure, but errors that had to do with some glitch or bug, if you like, in the human cognitive system, which might easily be just the result of some kind of reliable but not perfectly reliable heuristic that we use for making the judgments in thought experiments. So it seems that we were getting overfitting there because we got this instability in the analysis that people were putting forward. I mean, this program of somebody would put forward an analysis to fit the previous thought experiments. A new thought experiment would be produced that it gave the wrong result for. Then a more complex thought experiment, a more complex analysis would be proposed to take account of the new thought experiment. Then a further counterexamples would be proposed to that, and we were getting more and more complicated analyses. And so it was a kind of unfortunate progression that is very, very similar to what you get with overfitting in science. Now, so that I think was particularly clear in the case of analyses, but I don't think it's only there. But, and even when we're dealing with philosophical theories which are not in the form of analyses, I think something that has been characteristic of the methodology of analytic philosophy is that very little weight is given to aesthetic criteria, that the fact that theories are being put forward of these very ad hoc, complicated, messy kinds was not regarded as an objection to them. That was just regarded as, as it were, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. That this, as it were, tough-minded analytic philosophers had to deal with this kind of complexity. But as I say, I think the actual effect of it was that was overfitting, oversensitivity to any errors in the data derived from, for example, thought experiments, and that was producing a problem of that's related, or was related to the problem of error fragility I was talking about last time, and so giving proper weight to aesthetic criteria, I think, will help solve this problem, because they will allow us, or mandate us to be very suspicious of these complex theories, and to go back and wonder whether we may not have actually made some errors in our judgment of the data. So just to summarize what I've been arguing, I've been suggesting that to a significant extent, philosophy already applies an abductive method for deciding between theories. And so a lot of what I'm talking about is, as it were, is a description of what already happens in philosophy. But I've also pointed out a way in which we could actually follow this abductive methodology in a more wholehearted way. And I think we could do that better. We could do it better by being more thorough and more self-aware in our application of abductive methods. And I think that would give more weight to aesthetic criteria in philosophy, in comparing philosophical theories with each other. And as I think philosophers are kind of, they've perhaps been reluctant to take aesthetic criteria seriously enough, because they can't see what aesthetic criteria have to do with truth and so on. And and it is, I mean, that's something that one can respect, in the sense that that we do not yet have a full understanding of the role of the aesthetic criteria. But I think it's also pretty clear from the case of the natural sciences that they do have an important role in theory comparison, and that if we don't use them, we're going to get into trouble. And I think philosophers have been sometimes going wrong by not applying these aesthetic criteria in the way that they should. I suspect philosophers such as Plato had a much stronger sense of the importance of aesthetic criteria in theory choice than many of the people following this analytic method in the kind of overfitting way that it has been followed. So now just to look forward to lecture 6, which I think will be in 2 weeks' time, if I'm not mistaken. So often when you look at descriptions of philosophical method and philosophical argument, they suggest that we're using a deductive rather than abductive methodology. And often when analytic philosophers talk about their attitude to philosophy, they emphasize the need to produce arguments for everything you say, and often you see that they're thinking of the arguments as primarily deductive argument. And I think those descriptions of philosophical method are very unhelpful because they don't tell us how the premises of the deductions are obtained. And they also don't tell us how the deductive rules of inference are obtained. So far, I've been playing down the role of deduction in philosophy, but I do think that, in fact, deductive logic has an important role in philosophy. And in the next lecture, I'm going to explain how deductive logic fits into an overall abductive methodology. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Williamson, for your lecture. Now it's time for me to give a very short introduction to the interlocute and the question today. Dr. Arthur Sipper is an assistant professor at the Department of Philosophy, Peking University, and he specializes in metaphysics and philosophical methodology, with a special focus on truth-maker theory, aboutless subject matter, and their applications to other areas of philosophy. I just know Dr. Sipper was born in Beijing. He stayed at Beijing for 3 years in 1983 to 1986. Very interesting. Okay. Dr. Shi Zhou is an associate professor of philosophy at Eastern China Roma University. He focuses on issues from self-knowledge, philosophy of action, and sociality. Now it's the time for you too. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to respond to Professor Williamson's lecture on theory comparison in philosophy. For the next 11 or so minutes, the main aims of what I'm going to do is just raise a few questions and comments, mainly for clarification. I agree with quite a bit of what Professor Williamson says, but I want to press a few things. So one of the first questions I want to ask is, what exactly is a theory? I think perhaps we could get a little bit more clarity about this. He has said quite a bit. So one of the things he said is that a theory is an answer to a question, and then he compared it with analyses and with definitions and explanations. On that first one, I'd like to first give a little suggestion. I think the question-answer way of thinking about theories, and especially potentially of individuating theories, is very promising. Craig Roberts in linguistics has this notion of a question under discussion, which has become very important in theories of aboutness and subject matter in my work and Yablo's work, and in thinking about inquiry with Friedman. But something else that he says is that theories should explain our evidence. So minimally, theories need to explain or purport to explain something about a subject matter, and I think that's because we want to be able to compare theories for abductive reasons and the inference to the best explanation. Something else that he says here and also elsewhere, he's defended the kind of abductive paradigm in doing philosophy. He says that philosophy is a theory building enterprise with an overall abductive methodology. So the first problem, or the first question on this topic that I want to raise, is why I think that everything needs explanation. And related to this, philosophers past and present have argued that a potential domain of inquiry just doesn't need to be explained. So for the specific question here is, what would Williamson say in thinking about philosophy as a kind of abductive methodology about supposed anti-theories, and how would they fit into his conception of philosophy as theory building and theory comparison? So I'm thinking about anti-theories like nominalism and deflationism, about some of the examples that he's raised, about questions about the nature of truth, justice, and knowledge, where we want to give a constitutive explanation of these. They would say that this just can't be and shouldn't be done. These questions shouldn't be answered, not for the reasons that Williamson has given about knowledge, for instance, where he says that there is such a thing, but it's unanalyzable, not reducible to its component parts, but rather because there really are no such things as truth, justice, and knowledge. So they're kind of eliminativist rather than primitivist about the subject matter X. And then they would say that we just don't need to give such a theory. So for instance, about truth, they might say we just can't give a theory of truth. Rather, maybe we can at best give an account of the truth predicate and say things like it's useful for generalization, such as everything that Strawson said in his lectures, Naturalism and Skepticism, is true, so as not to have to repeat everything that Strawson said sentence by sentence. But I think a potential deeper problem that the anti-theories raise for an overall abductive methodology is that what they do is just give a blanket rejection of data, or what Williamson says as pieces of evidence which need explanation. So compare that to correspondence theories and coherentist and pragmatist theories of truth. They all assume that there is something that needs to be accounted for, truth, and intuitions about truth, for instance, the correspondence intuition about truth. But nominalism and deflationism of some sorts would reject all this and reject any theory of truth. And explicitly, sometimes they say that we just don't need any explanation of truth. If there is no such thing, then one can't explain that thing. So the general worry is just how does Williamson envisage accounting for those who reject the need for explanation altogether about some subject matter. There are two further problems that this raises, I think. So an anti-theory, you might think in explaining what a theory is a little bit more deeply, and what explanation is that these anti-theories turn out to be theories that in some sense explain things anyways, despite what the defenders have thought. The danger of this is that potentially theory and explanation becomes a little bit vague to be explanatory of this issue, because even a theory which rejects the need for a theory of X turns out to be a theory of X. On the other side, an anti-theory, you might say that anti-theory just doesn't explain and isn't a theory, as the defenders would claim. According to an overall abductive methodology, whole swathes of philosophers will turn out not to be philosophers. Maybe this seems like a problematic result, especially given something that he said earlier, which I think was very plausible and attractive, that to be a philosopher, one needs to seriously engage and participate in the discussions and arguments of the community of philosophers. But one might think that the proposal that he's giving, the overall proposal of abductive philosophy, is not descriptive. So we're not giving an explanation of what philosophy is, but rather that this is a normative proposal about how philosophy should be done, potentially despite lots of philosophers' practice. So this normative fix would then have two further interpretations. One, he's just merely prescribing this as one of many possible good methodologies in philosophy, none of which are clearly better than other, or the abductive view is the only good way of doing philosophy. If A is right, how would he reconcile this with the centrality of what he's been arguing for, potentially, of this centrality of abductive the methodology? Why prescribe this at all if it's just one of many? why not compare it to other good philosophical methodologies, whatever they might be, rather than just comparing it to natural science and mathematics, and rather than also comparing it to failed methodologies such as philosophy purely as clarification. Because he doesn't do these things, potentially B is a better option. If B, maybe this would be restrictive and anti-pluralist. It would be pluralist about philosophical theories, let 1,000 or more philosophical theories bloom, but monistic perhaps of philosophical conceptions, accept the abductive paradigm, or you're doing bad philosophy. Okay, the problem with B is that it would dismiss from the outset perfectly respectable and good philosophical views, such as nominalism, deflationism, about truth, and various kinds of eliminativism, either as bad philosophical views because they don't propose to explain anything, or bad philosophical views because they're not theories at all and don't fit the abductive paradigm. Is this what he's endorsing? This is just a question. It would potentially be a worrying result if he is. Two more specific worries about this overall topic. The case for the abductive methodology is mainly to compare it to science and math, except maybe the end of today's lecture, he hasn't really given us examples of serious philosophical arguments that have been abductive, and no examples of serious philosophical disputes where we have two theories that can be adjudicated via aesthetic criteria such as elegance. And without these, maybe there's less reason to think that the abductive methodology is right. And I think here an overall question is there even one knockdown, one good case of a decisive, convincing, and generally accepted use of abductive reasoning either in contemporary philosophy or history of philosophy? And another question is, in simple disputes, this is something he actually raised today. This is a real potential dispute with a theory of knowledge where knowledge entails truth. Somebody might come along and say, in case C, somebody believes that P, but P isn't true. According to this theory, we might be able to infer that S doesn't know. Is this really an explanatory inference? That's one question. Someone might argue, according to this case, that S does actually know, and then think that this is a counterexample, and then infer an alternative theory where knowledge doesn't entail knowledge doesn't entail truth. But if we take these two theories, should we adjudicate between them because one is more beautiful or simple than the other? I'm not totally sure that's clear. One final worry here about abductive methodology as a descriptive proposal is, with a little imagination and charity, I think lots of deductive philosophical arguments, or ones that have been proposed as deductive, can be better interpreted as abductive. I think that's the case. Because many deductive arguments that have been proposed are actually invalid if you take a broader, larger, better view of the theoretical landscape. I've argued this in argument against arguments for states of affairs, truthmaker arguments, and famously causal theories of perception have been undermined in this way. But I think what this reveals is these arguments are weaker than the proponents thought them to be. So this is a descriptive proposal about most philosophy, because no positive philosophical theory has ever been generally accepted, unlike in mathematics and science. Potentially this is because of an abductive methodology. So that's a question. My final worry has to do with the aesthetic criteria. So he asked a very, very, very good and important question. Why should we expect truth to be simple or elegant? And he gives the toy story of T1 and T2, two rival theories, and then a gerrymandered theory, T star. And he says that physicists would just reject T star as too complicated, inelegant, ugly, messy, and ad hoc. And also the infinitely many theories like T star that can be constructed, and he suggests philosophers should do the same. My question here is, how deep does the abductive reasoning and thinking abductively in this way go, and how deep does considering the aesthetic criteria go? Why reject T star? I think because of implausibility. Maybe ugliness is a sign of implausibility, but I think this could be explained a bit more and needs to be explained. In the philosophy of science, there have been several proposals to explain this, to explain what grounds abductive reasoning and also aesthetic criteria. One is to say that theories like T star are just not inductively entrenched. We just don't reason in this way. And another reason is that abductive reasoning is grounded by induction, because more elegant and simple theories have given us true predictions in the past. Both of these groundings of abductive methodologies would allow us to accept an abductive methodology, but potentially ultimately because of induction. So potentially we should call this an inductive paradigm rather than the abductive paradigm. And just a small question on this. Williamson hasn't mentioned induction at all. I wonder why. He might think that abduction should just replace induction, but the question then still remains, why reason with abduction? Are the reasons abductive? Should we ground abductive reasoning with abductive reasoning, like many philosophers have famously argued in analogous cases that would be potentially circular. Thank you for great lectures, and thank you for listening.
Oh.
Okay, thanks for the introduction and invitation. Sorry, I need to share my screen. Can you just?
Yeah.
Yeah, basically, I will just ask two questions about Williamson's lecture. The first one would be, is theory more likely to be justified by evidence if it explains evidence, and why? In his lecture, Williamson points out that theory is preferred not just to be consistent with evidence, but to do something more, such as explain the evidence. He claimed that this is also appropriate to characterize philosophical theory. Evidence that a given action is unjust probably justifies the theory of justice when a theory would explain why it is unjust. That seems to me particularly related to the connections between confirmation and explanation. And Williamson appears to hold an explanationist theory view of confirmation, which maintains that the evidential justification could be constructed from the relations of theoretical explanation. On the contrary, people who oppose the explanationist view would say, even if a theory has explained evidence, it is not reasonable enough to assert a justifying connection between them. Evidential justification is supposed to aim at truth, while explanatory powers are evaluated from attempts for understanding. A success on the latter might not always imply another success on the former. For instance, I can say, suppose I attend to a magic show and I'm attracted so much by what the juggler has done. After backing home, I decide to figure out how the juggler realized those seemingly impossible things. And I can manage to realize the same thing by myself, just like trying my best to resolve a puzzle. Though the juggler's magic show has been explained by my resolution, it may still not have justified to say that the juggler was doing just as what I have found. Even if my resolution makes the juggler's work more understandable, this success cannot exclude other possibilities, which was true for the juggler's way of magical show. So, and back to Professor Williamson's example, even if a theory of justice has explained why an action is unjust, that does not mean the explanandum provides evidential justification for the very theory, since a mere understandable success cannot exclude other possibilities to be true for the reasons of injustice. So this is the first question for me. And the second question is like this. Concerning to the abductive reasoning, could aesthetic criteria be construed as at least indirectly or contingently related to the aim of truth? In talking about abduction, Williamson puts clear emphasis on aesthetic criteria in theory comparison, such as simplicity and elegance. His argument involves two main reasons. First, without applying aesthetic criteria, scientists or philosophers might waste time on proliferating rival theories. And second, scientific and philosophical theories might be overfitting and oversensitive to inaccuracies in the data, which makes those analyses more and more ugly and messy. It seems necessary to emphasize aesthetic criteria in order to solve that problem. But Williamson said very few on the relationship between aesthetic criteria and the truth goal of inquiry, which seems very different from some salient proponents of abduction. Compared to Peter Lipton, for example, his theory of IBE gives more attention on the relationship between loveliness and likeliness. Philosophical theory construction is justified to employ the inference to the best explanation because theories that are more lovely according to aesthetic criteria would be more likely to be true. This is why IBE or abductive reasoning has usually been considered as a productive strategy for realism, since it indeed try to attain truth more than mere observability, so-called. That concern seems also unavoidable for Williamson's argument. Why is it a disappointing thing for theory becoming more and more ugly and messy? If there is no particular connection between aesthetic criteria and the truth, it seems not justified enough to claim that an ugly and messy theory is unacceptable purely based upon the criteria of simplicity and elegance. So this question would be something similar to the interlocutor's question, the last question. But if we try to give such a connection, it would be still problematic on how criteria merely on aesthetic concern could provide indications on whether theory is true or not. It seems a very hard time for every abductivist here. And I do wonder how Williamson conceived this about this question. So this is my question. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you both for those good questions. So I'll start by replying to Arthur Schipper's questions. And so there was a lot in what he said. I may not manage to answer everything, but so he was one issue that he was pressing was what to make of theories which are not explanatory, and he was offering nominalism and deflationism as examples of that. So, of course, there's a sense in which you could say that well, many deflations, not all, but many say there's no such thing as truth, and as it were, in the abstract, I mean, there's no such thing as a property of truth, and of course, if nominalism is supposed to be a theory of universals, then there may be a sense in which nominalists think that there are no universals. But I think that if you look at what nominalists and deflationists do, you see that their methodology is actually much closer to the one that I was describing than you might think. So if we start with deflationists, I mean, Horwich, he's written Paul Horwich at NYU, he's written a book called Truth. So he obviously thinks that in some sense the word is meaningful. And if you look at what he's doing in that book, he's putting forward a very simple theory. Well, I mean, I think the natural thing to say is a theory of truth, but if we want to avoid the abstract noun, I mean, it's a simple theory of how truth predicates work, and a lot of what he's doing in that book is in fact offering explanations of various things that people have noticed about the way truth talk operates, and showing how they can be explained in line with his deflationist account. And so he goes through a large number of phenomena, e.g., about phenomena about the role of true belief in getting us what we want or whatever, and phenomena which people have suggested a deflationist theory of truth couldn't explain, and showing how it can explain them. And I mean, that's an important part of his case. And I think the simplicity of the deflationist account is another part of what deflationists find attractive in the view. And in the case of nominalists, well, I mean, of course, in the Middle Ages, nominalism was, you might think of someone like William of Ockham, who of course gave his name to Occam's razor, which an Occam's razor, I mean, not multiplying entities without necessity. It's quite closely related to abductive criteria of explanation. I mean, as it were, don't bring in lots of entities which are not really doing any explanatory work and so on. And nominalists typically spend a lot of their dialectical time in explaining how phenomena which their opponents are saying can't be explained within the nominalist framework can in fact be explained. So they're on the one, I think both with nominalism and with deflationism, they're putting forward a simple view that, as it were, has some of the typical abductive merits, and then they're showing, or at least attempting to show, how it can explain a large number of the phenomena that have been treated as relevant for assessing theories of that matter. So I think that although they're, as well, we may not be able to, with complete accuracy, to describe what they're doing as explaining blah, where blah is some abstract noun. It seems to me that they are in fact engaged in some kind of abductive enterprise. And as what's meant to be attractive about their view are recognizably abductive virtues. I mean, whether it really these theories are really in the end, as it were, win on abductive grounds is another matter. But I don't think that they represent some completely different methodology. Also, he mentioned the issue about whether we can explain everything, and of course, any explanations come to an end, and any theory is likely to have some first principles which it offers no further explanation of. I mean, I was specifically talking about explanation of the evidence, but it could be. I mean, for example, I don't think that it's. I mean, part of our evidence might be that there is something rather than nothing, and it's not out of the question that that's something that can't be explained. So, I don't think that it's, as it were, that we simply eliminate a theory which isn't able to explain everything. It's that the more a theory can explain, the better, other things being equal. And so that's still not it's not completely uncontroversial. There will be people who simply reject the explanatoriness as a relevant criterion, and I certainly wouldn't want to say that they're not philosophers. I think if they may be very recognizably philosophers, and so I don't think that the fact that somebody is rejecting the abductive methodology means that they're not a philosopher. I also think, in principle, you could have a natural scientist who rejected abduction. I doubt that they would be very good at the job, but they doesn't mean that they wouldn't count as a natural scientist. So I think, I mean, the view that I've been putting forward is to some extent a descriptive one, and I think that that really an awful lot of the history of philosophy has in fact been to do with people putting forward theories on fundamentally abductive grounds. But of course, they weren't saying I'm using abduction here or something like that. Or, but it's equally true that in the natural sciences, people follow an broadly abductive methodology. I take it, but they don't describe what they're doing as abduction or inference to the best explanation. But I mean, they will sometimes point to ways in which theories are explanatory or are simple or the opposite, and I think that's what you find in the history of philosophy. And so in particular, I was suggesting even that the cases which were proposed as ones of people not following, as well, ideologically not following an abductive methodology like nominalism and deflations, in fact, that is what they're doing. And yeah, oh yes, and I mean, the issue was raised about what counts as a theory, which I wondered whether to say something about that. But I think, I mean, if you look in philosophy of science, I mean, often, the traditional definition of a theory, or in logic, was just a set of sentences closed under logical consequence. And of course, that covers an enormous number of cases. I don't think one should be too restrictive about what counts as a theory. I mean, the term itself is not very informative. I mean, often something, a speculative hypothesis will be called a theory, so that a speculative hypothesis about who killed JF Kennedy or something that will be regarded, maybe called a theory. I don't think one needs to have a restrictive view of what counts as a theory, but I think that in the case of philosophy, on this the hypotheses that have been put forward do have this theoretical character, and that you see in what are called theories in the natural sciences. I mean, they're very general. They're somewhat abstracted from the level of the initial bits of evidence that they're based on, and so on. I think all I have on the issue about the relation between abduction and induction. I think it's, well, I'm not going to give either an it's not that I'm proposing some strange justification of abduction in terms of induction or in terms of abduction. I mean, I think that I think one thing's what maybe worth saying is that if you think about very early ancient Greek philosophy, I think it's pretty clear that people were already moved by abductive criteria at a time when abduction did not have an impressive track record. So I don't think that, as it were, in abduction is something that we accept on inductive grounds. But I do think there is some subsequent inductive evidence in its favor. But I think abduction is something that probably pretty much hardwired into us, but I certainly, I'm not offering that as a justification for it, and I think there's a limit to how far justification can be taken. There's a lot. Yeah, sorry, I've been going on a bit too long, so I should stop there and say something in answer to. This is going to be a terrible mispronunciation, but Xu Zhu's questions. So on the first question, part of what was being raised was a challenge, as I understood it, about different aims for inquiry, with a contrast between truth and understanding. And the suggestion was that maybe some inquiries are aiming at understanding but not at truth. Now, so that isn't how I understand the relation between truth and understanding at all. So if we're aiming at truth, I think really what we're aiming at is we want to know the truth, and so knowing the truth is in effect what we're aiming at is knowledge. So it would be a contrast between knowledge and understanding. But if you're giving the example of somebody doing magic tricks, and then we were working out, well, we wanted to understand these tricks. I think it matters whether the question is how did the magician do the trick, or how could that trick be done. And so if we want to understand how the trick was done, we only understand how the trick was done if we give an account which matches what the magician actually did. But if we're just interested in the question, how could that trick be done, without, as it were, caring whether it was how the magician actually did it, then it doesn't matter whether the way that we produce corresponds to the way that the magician actually did it. But that's not because truth doesn't matter. It's just because the question is different. And so what we're interested in basically is giving a true answer to the question, how could that trick be done? And so I don't think there's there's really some kind of opposition between truth and understanding here. I think it would first of all be an issue about knowledge versus understanding, but even there, it's not really a contrast, because what we're trying to understand is either how something was done or how it could be done, but that's pretty much the same as knowing how it was done or how it could be done. So I kind of would reject the contrast between truth and understanding as aims. I don't think there is an aim of understanding that doesn't care about truth, but you just have to be careful about truth in about what question is actually being answered. So your second question was about the aesthetic role of truth, and you were contrasting what I was saying with what Peter Lipton says in his book about inference to the best explanation. I mean, actually, Peter Lipton was maybe my best friend in philosophy. We were graduate students together, and I was, I got interested in the topic of inference to the best explanation partly because he was writing his doctorate on it, and so we spent a lot of time talking about it. And I don't really think that there's a substantial disagreement between his approach and mine, insofar as he was, there are things I was saying that don't correspond to anything in his book, but it's not really that I kind of disagree with anything that he was saying. But I think the biggest difference is that he was writing a book and I was giving a lecture of an hour and a half, and and so he could go into the relation between loveliness and likeliness, in much more detail than I could. But I think that it's not that the issue of likeliness is somehow irrelevant to philosophy. We would like our hypotheses that were being put forward to be likely to be true, but we have this methodology which has this, as it were, which is somehow using loveliness as an indicator of likeliness, and quite how that works, it's hard to say. I think, of course, if we're likeliness suggests a kind of probabilistic methodology, and definitely one of Lipton's ideas was that he opposed people like Van Fraassen, who were claiming that there was some tension between inference to the best explanation and a probabilistic methodology, by arguing that that the probabilistic, that inference to the best explanation might play a role in determining what the prior probability distribution would be, and I'm not opposed to that. I don't find the probabilistic framework terribly helpful for discussing philosophical methodology, because we're so far from being able to put probabilities on the hypotheses that we're talking about. You know, I don't think that it explains very much. I think although it's not straightforward to explain how the abductive methodology and the sort of probabilistic methodology fit together, because, for example, strength seems to be anti-probabilistic rather than pro-probabilistic. But I think in the end that there isn't really some deep tension between them, because both methodologies are relevant to quite a lot of scientific inquiry, where it's much more illuminating to put it in a probabilistic framework than in the case of philosophy, because there are natural probability distributions around, but still people are still working also with an abductive methodology, and it's pretty clear that these in some way they're not ultimately in conflict with each other, but it is very, I certainly would agree that it's a very tricky task to put an overall framework which neatly explains how they fit together. Okay, I better stop there. But and again, I know there are things that each said that I haven't properly answered, but I'll leave it there.
Thank all of you very much, Professor Williamson, Professor Arthur Sipper, Professor Xu Zhu. I have to explain something about our lectures. There will be a long holidays in our country. One holiday is national celebration for our republic, and the Moon Festival, a very traditional Chinese holiday. So our lecture have stopped almost 2 weeks, where we restart on October 12. There will be other 5 lectures. Very interesting topic: philosophy and logic, philosophy and history of philosophy, philosophy and its labels, philosophy and models, and philosophy and its future. Very interesting topic. So welcome everyone here to attend other 5 lectures, but we have to wait almost 2 weeks. Okay, thank all of you. Good night.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Yeah, okay.